Today on Stronger Than Reason, we've got the latest doo-doo with Beastie Boys' 1994 classic, Ill Communication. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. So today I want to talk about stew. That's right, stew. You know, it's somewhere between soup and a plate of meat and veggies, and when done properly, you can either eat it with a spoon or a fork. It doesn't matter. Sure, good stew has a lot of great ingredients, meat, vegetables, sauce, spices, but the thing that makes it truly great is when all those flavors mix together and combine as it cooks. In fact, when we make stew here at the house, it's often better the next day after all the flavors have had a chance to really mix, because that interaction of different ingredients, the way they come together and play off each other in unexpected ways, is really the joy of stew. Now, this effect isn't limited to stew. It's just the first thing that came to my mind. The second thing that came to my mind is, a good stir fry, the kind where you have some leftover rice from the day before and you raid the fridge for other ingredients, just taking whatever is at hand, maybe some chopped vegetables or some protein left over from the weekend's takeout. Maybe you pull some stuff from the garden if you have it. Anything goes, right? You just throw all that stuff in a pan, you turn up the heat, and you add a bit of oil, and just mix it all together with a fried egg. Why not? It's a protein blast. And if you do it right, you'll get that same interplay of flavors and textures that makes a good stew so good. Not only that, though, but there's an element of surprise! That's right, surprise. Maybe you didn't expect to taste the salmon alongside the pico di gallo. But you know what? It's not bad. And in a way, it could inspire you to other culinary creations, right? Just randomly mixing things, and it just lets you explore the flavor landscape. It's a mechanism to keep you, the cook, from getting in a rut. And that's actually a scientific concept. You see, I'm a computer science nerd, and when I was in school, I did some research on algorithms, which are, procedures for solving problems. In particular, I worked with heuristics, which are algorithms that are inexact, but they give pretty good results in cases where exact algorithms would just take too long to be practical. So heuristics come up a lot when you're grappling with problems that are computationally difficult. The problems I worked with were in combinatorics, meaning the problem posed a huge set of possible solutions, and it was my job to write a heuristic to explore them and get a good result. Maybe not always the best result, but a good result. And there were a lot of standard approaches to doing that, and some of them were modeled after real-world things, like climbing hills, or annealing metal, or genetics, or even modeling the collective behavior of ant colonies. And I found that last one to be pretty interesting and dove into it, because if you think about it, each ant acts locally, but they can communicate and collaborate in such a way that they can work together to solve difficult problems, like identifying the shortest path between 2 points. There's no single ant that solves it. It's the global solution that emerges from their local collaboration. So I messed with all of these things, and it was really interesting. And what I found was that it helped to think of all possible solutions as a landscape that you had to explore. And the height of the landscape, so to speak, at each point told you how good that particular solution was. So obviously your goal would be to find the highest peak in the entire landscape, but that wasn't always achievable. Often it was just good enough to find a relatively high peak. So the trouble was, it was common for my heuristic to get stuck, meaning I converged on a peak too soon and just didn't explore enough. So I found it pretty effective to have a heuristic that balanced between exploring and converging. You wanted to explore enough of the solution space that you were reasonably sure you'd find a good result, but eventually you'd want to converge on that result and not just explore forever. So stew and stir fry present good opportunities to explore the culinary landscape by collecting a bunch of semi-random ingredients and either slow cooking them or flash frying them to get a result that hopefully will be a local maximum in terms of taste, texture, and general deliciosity. Now, right about now, anyone in my family, if they listen to this show, which they definitely do not, would be raising their hand and saying, hang on, Mr. Stronger Than Reason is the pickiest eater in the whole family. And I mean the whole extended family. He's never even eaten a cheeseburger in his whole life. His diet is anything but adventurous, and he does not enjoy trying new things. So don't believe a word he says. And to that, I can only say, it's a good thing none of them listen to this, right? Anyway, I think my point still holds, intellectually speaking. And to tie it back to the whole point of this show, I would argue that the same is true with music. I love it when bands mash up all kinds of influences into some crazy Frankenstein's monster that we have never heard before. And I love it when I'm listening to an album and the songs aren't all the same, or even more so, when I'm constantly surprised and delighted by unexpected tasty bits. You know, when the spices and the flavors and the textures and the rhythms and the mouthfeel combine in exciting new ways. Hold on, I lost track about whether I'm talking about food or music. Anyway, I think it's evident in some of the bands I've talked about in this show, right? Like the Beta Band, for instance, in episode 9. They were well known for throwing the kitchen sink into an album. You drop the needle on one of their records, you had no idea what to expect. And that was half of what made them great. And the same is true for a lot of the other bands to greater or lesser extents. So Revco, of course, mashed up industrial beats with redneck hoedowns and rap, and Tones on Tail mashed up experimental noise with goth and surf rock and synth pop and God knows what else. And The Art of Noise blended samples and hip-hop beats with classical arrangements and movie scores. And maybe Skinny Puppy mashed things up to the most granular level possible because they built entire albums out of samples and sounds that were never more than a few seconds long, just sampling anything and everything and making something completely new from it. Or for that matter, consider the Beatles, at least from, say, Rubber Soul on through Let It Be. They had a lot of experimentation and variation on those records, like the White Album in particular. But there is a band I haven't talked about yet that also did this. And what's more, they grew to a level of popularity that exceeded most of the bands on this show, with, as ever, the possible exceptions of U2, Depeche Mode, and Pink Floyd. Because this band bridged not only genres, but also cultures. They acted as a sort of Rosetta Stone for music lovers in the 80s and beyond, and their great strength was in amalgamating styles and genres and references into an amazing stew or stir-fry. Or perhaps a stir-fry stew, if we can postulate the existence of such a thing. But they came on the scene in '86 with their first album, which was, pretty hard to ignore at the time. I was in middle school and was well aware of it from MTV, but, I wasn't a fan per se. I didn't run out and buy it, and I don't recall their second album coming out in 1989, although now, of course, it's a fan favorite and is recognized as a unique historical turning point in not only hip-hop, but in sampling culture and music history in general. But at the time, I didn't even know that it had come out. Their third album came out in '92 when I was in college. That one made an impression. A good friend of mine had the CD and would play it from time to time, and that's how this band really got on my radar. I was more into music in college than maybe any other time in my life so far. So even him playing this CD now and then made a bigger impression on me. And I noticed these guys on MTV some more. But it wasn't until their fourth album in '94 that I really got aboard. This would be the one that made an impression on me personally, that soaked its way through my extremely hard head. Did I run out and buy it? I did not. But we did listen to it a lot. And with this band, these are the songs and videos that really stuck with me over the years. And eventually this band would come around again with me much later in life. I would rediscover them and in a way discover them for the first time, not really having fully gotten into them back in the day. And what do you know? There was an entire world there for me to dig into and enjoy. The band, of course, is New York's own Beastie Boys, and their fourth album is their classic Ill Communication, released on their own Grand Royal label in May of 1994. And that was just 2 months after the Downward Spiral, by the way, if you're keeping track. So what was my relationship to Beastie Boys? Well, they were pretty inescapable in the pop culture of the late 80s. I mostly knew them from their first album, Licensed to Ill, and their breakout hit, You Gotta Fight for Your Right to Party. As I said, that album came out in 86, and I was in middle school, so what was that, maybe 7th grade, 8th grade? And I remember I had a music teacher at the time who was really cool, and she let us bring in pop music to play, and then we would kind of talk about it in a critical way. She was maybe the first person I knew who actually stepped back and considered the message that a song might be sending. And I remember her asking the class, "Do you really have a right to party?" And of course, we knew enough even then as 8th graders to say, no. But I'm sure that was the first time I really thought about song lyrics, separate from listening to the song itself. So that was a bit of a revelation to me. And, even now, lyrics tend to hit me a lot harder when I'm reading them off a page or a screen as poetry versus hearing them in context in the song, because reading them gives a bit of distance and helps me think about them critically. Plus, a lot of singers mumble, so it's hard to even hear what they're saying. The other thing I remember about Licensed to Ill was the fact that my long ago best friend had a copy on vinyl, and he had moved to the big city in 3rd grade or so. So, maybe he was a bit more sophisticated than me, which isn't saying much. But when I went to the city to visit him once, he showed me the cover and gleefully told me that it had a secret message, and he brought me over to the mirror and explained how the tail number on the airplane 3MTA3, when you looked at it in the mirror, spelled out "eat me." And then he had to explain what that meant, of course. So yeah, for me, that was pretty close to what the Buddhists call enlightenment. So that guy was a good influence on me. Even though we didn't listen to the album much, my respect for the band increased a notch due to their subversive sense of humor. I love some subversion. So a lot could be said about this album, but I'm not going to say it here. Maybe that'll be another episode someday. Who knows? But the bigger question is, what was my experience with rap back in the day? Again, I don't have a lot to tell. It was just another genre to me, like country, western, show tunes, zydeco, and opera that I wasn't especially into. And that is to say, I didn't seek it out, but I did enjoy some of the rap that I heard. And maybe my earliest exposure to it was when some of my friends made copies of Two Live Crew's first album. That was Two Live Crew Is What We Are. And it made a pretty big splash with us. It had explicit lyrics, it had crude humor. It was pretty much made for young teens to listen to in an illicit way and just really enjoy. So, of course, right around that time, Run DMC reinvented Aerosmith's Walk This Way. And you know what? I had never seen Two Live Crew on MTV, at least not for their first album, Lord knows. But MTV did play the Walk This Way video all the time. So it gave those of us in the sticks a visual for this whole rap thing. And it was cool. And of course, rap and hip hop would only become more and more popular. Rap artists would find their way onto the radio and MTV. And so we all eventually got familiar with the big names of the time, like Public Enemy and Kool Moe Dee and LL Cool J. And maybe some of the more lighthearted acts got more radio play, like Tone Loc and Kid and Play, Young MC, and of course, DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince. All that said, the rap album that I personally got the most into back in the day, along with most of my friends, came out in 1988, and it was called Straight Outta Compton by the band NWA. And that record was something else entirely at the time. I'd never heard anything like it lyric-wise. It was just coming from a world that was pretty hard for me to imagine. I was pretty sheltered. But what stood out to me personally about it, honestly, was the music. It was the beats, it was the production, because they were phenomenal. So props to Dr. Dre for that. This was in 88 and 89, right when I was really getting into electronic music, like club music. And to hear those hard hitting beats like on the title track was just amazing. And I still love those songs. So if you take those tracks, the music tracks, and add the rhymes that these guys were doing, it was so wild. It was just over the top. I mean, no other rap record to that point gave me that sort of kick, and it was a real rush. But by the 90s, of course, rap started to blend with those other genres, much like with a good stew, and it was even influencing and affecting other alternative music that I was listening to from artists who were, on the face of it, very different. For instance, KRS-One did a guest rap on REM's Out of Time, or, Al Jorgensen brought in a rapper for The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste, or, everything Meat Beat Manifesto ever recorded. It was just all blending together. The other thing about the culture of the late 80s was this, and I somehow managed to go 66 episodes without mentioning it, but it was skateboarding. See, skateboarding was super big, and there was some overlap between skating culture and hip-hop, and some of my friends identified as skaters, and for sure, for a while, I tried to too. The way you do as a kid when you try on different identities. So for a hot minute there, I had a skateboard and the right clothes, but not the hair. I wasn't fooling anyone with my hair. It definitely wasn't skater hair. But I was an art kid, as I mentioned, and graffiti was a thing. And my friends and I worked on a few graffiti murals around town, and those were like paid gigs. It wasn't like a vandalism thing. And hey, graffiti was as much a part of skating culture as hip-hop and hardcore punk. So there was a similar visual thing going on among all these subcultures. But at the end of the day, I had a problem because I simply couldn't skate very well. And really, I didn't enjoy it as much as other kids. And that not only ended my skating career, but it might have had a hand in me not making the kind of friends that could have led me to a greater appreciation of Beastie Boys, not to mention punk bands like Minor Threat and the Misfits. In fact, part of me rebelled against liking any of that skater music since I failed so bad at skating, which I guess I confess up to now with 35 years of hindsight. I definitely missed out on some cool stuff. But yeah, I will tell you straight up that I am not some scholar of hip-hop or rap. I dabble in a lot of kinds of music, so with rap, I'm just a dabbler. And I'll tell you right now that I am absolutely 100% not familiar with any modern rap acts. I mean, I've heard a lot of them. How could I not when they're featured on, every Super Bowl halftime show? But I haven't really listened to them. And I think that's less of a me not liking rap thing than it is just a I don't listen to any new music anymore thing. I don't know what the latest industrial bands are either. And for the most part, I just don't care because sometimes these modern bands do sort of seep through, like with Ghost and Viagra Boys. I featured some of those bands on previous episodes. And that's okay, but I don't spend much energy seeking this stuff out. I have more than enough to listen to just with my current collection and more old classics to explore. And, part of the problem with modern music is that there are just way too many bands. But that has got to be its own episode because if I start complaining about that here, I am going to completely forget all about ill communication. So yeah, the TLDR is I am not a rap scholar or historian. My own experience with the genre was limited to what you'd expect of a late 80s teenager with access to a radio and MTV and a few cool friends who like to share their music. So let's go back to Beastie Boys. Who were they? I was aware from videos that the band was just three guys, and from the music press that they were three young Jewish white guys from New York. So not exactly your stereotypical rap group. And they were Adam Yauch, a.k.a. MCA, Michael Diamond, a.k.a. Mike D, and Adam Horovitz, a.k.a. Ad Rock. And they were young punks, literally, because they had gotten their start playing in local punk bands, but had gotten really, really into the rap music that had started to come out around the mid-'80s and just sort of gravitated towards it because they loved it so much. And soon enough, they were writing their own rhymes. And the band, which despite its name had previously included a lady drummer, Kate Schellenbach, would shift from punk to rap. And I was also aware that despite their punk history, they had plenty of cred in the music industry. No one could deny that their early success had a big hand in bringing rap to a much wider audience. So their first album, License to Ill, was more or less frat rap crossed with metal. Of course, it was produced by their friend and soon-to-be music impresario Rick Rubin, who would go on to found Def Jam Recordings and much else. And, Rick had recruited some guy from a metal band on his label. I don't know. Kerry King of a band called Slayer? Whatever happened to him? But he recruited him to play some metal riffs on License to Ill. And that's Kerry on Fight for Your Right and No Sleep Till Brooklyn. Of course, the album kind of backfired on the boys since it labeled them as the ultimate dude bros when in fact they wrote these songs just to make fun of dude bros. They were at their heart just nerds, not avatars of knuckle-dragging masculinity. So for their second album, they went with a more artistic statement. Paul's Boutique came out in 1989 and was an entirely different affair. No Rick Rubin this time. Instead, they had partnered with the Dust Brothers, who were two guys from L.A. who were early experts at the art of building beats from samples. And the public was baffled at first. Where was the frat rap? Where was the metal guitar? And it took a few years for folks to recognize Paul's Boutique for what it was, a masterpiece, a watershed moment. Never before had a rap album been composed entirely from samples. In fact, this album could not be made today. It would be either impossible or financially prohibitive to acquire the rights to all of the samples. And it was made in a very specific slot in time where someone not only had the skill to do it, but there weren't yet entire battalions of lawyers ready to drop copyright strikes at the merest provocation. So in time, Paul's Boutique was redeemed as a critically acclaimed masterpiece that paved the way for sample-based rapping. And sample-based music of all kinds, really. And by the way, this is a total aside. So many rappers would rhyme over beatboxes like the Roland TR-808, for instance, which, as another aside, I got to state that Ad Rock was one of the first major proponents of the TR-808, and the band used it heavily on early tracks like on Paul Revere, where MCA had the idea to reverse the beat. That was really innovative at the time. And he had gotten the idea from hearing about tape loop experiments and from making his own tape loops. In fact, Ad Rock tells the story of how MCA came up with the beat for Ryman and Steelin' by making a tape loop of the intro to Zeppelin's When the Levee Breaks. He was just an innovative and experimental guy. But one of the coolest things I remember from 91 was when LL Cool J appeared on MTV Unplugged, because at first I thought, how is he going to do that? Like, unplugged rapping? Like, how does that work? But when I watched it, I was blown away because, of course, he had a dude on a drum kit just rocking it out, and other dudes on acoustic guitar and bass, and a dude on a piano, and LL just killed it. He 100% completely killed it. Just a fantastic performance. I don't care if you like rap or not. It was just great stuff. Definitely the most energetic MTV Unplugged performance ever. So just go out there and watch Mama Said Knock You Out and tell me what you think. He made it very clear that you don't need electricity to rap. So back to Beastie Boys. They switched it up again in 92 with their third album, Check Your Head. I remember a skater buddy of mine had this record. We listened to it now and then, usually in the car while driving around. I remember Professor Booty was a favorite track. And the thing I remember most about this album kind of follows on from what I just said about LL Cool J. And it was the fact that the Beasties, for the first time, played their own instruments. And, why not? They were musicians. They'd been in punk bands over the years. In general, their lineup was Ad Rock on guitar, MCA on bass, and Mike D on drums, although I'm sure there was some degree of switching around. And for fun, they brought in Mark Nishida, a.k.a. Money Mark, on keys, which was truly inspired. And Mark's entree into the Beasties' world was actually as their carpenter fixing a broken door. But they soon found out he could do other things, like help them build their entire studio, and he could also play some mean piano and organ, because Mark is a man of many talents, so they quickly put him to better use. I think this album, Check Your Head, defined the next era of the Beasties sound, at least for the next few albums, but I'm not going to talk about it because apart from a few tracks, I haven't listened to it as much as their next album, the fourth album, Ill Communication. So just bear in mind that the two albums are stylistically similar, and some of what we'll discuss about one also applies to the other. And I just want to point out that I absolutely love the first track on here, Jimmy James. It's a classic. So, all right, on to Ill Communication. No relation to License to Ill, even though both were ill in their own ways. So I started listening to this album, like really digesting it deeply in 2019. And why did it take me so long, 25 years to get into it? And the simple answer was because I bought the Beastie Boys book. And in short, this is a fantastic retrospective of their career, written by none other than Ad Rock and Mike D. If you've listened to me this long, here today, 20-some minutes, you probably know a very sad fact, and that is that we lost MCA to cancer in 2012. MCA was, by all accounts, a great human being. I didn't know the extent to which that was true until I read this book, and now I can say for sure that the world is a crappier place without him in it, but he did have a tremendous impact on the world for good, so R.I.P. MCA. But Ad Rock and Mike D have done a good job here. Even without him, the stories are all in their own unmistakable voices with attribution. There is no ghostwriting going on here. And kids, here's a pro tip. Always get it from the horse's mouth when you can. Don't rely on an intermediary. An autobiography is always better than a biography. So I picked this book up on a whim thinking, yeah, what the hell? It's got to be somewhat interesting, right? And I was expecting some dry tome with just pages and pages of text. But this thing really blew me away because it is a multimedia extravaganza. And, you know, why did that surprise me, right? It just has a ton of these like short sections in it that are all very readable. Just a lot of different stories from different perspectives. All sorts of cool pictures of the early days of the band and so on. A lot of artifacts and relics and cool drawings. There's a comic book in here that tells a story in comic book form. There's a handwritten note from Madonna. There's a cookbook later in here. There's just a bunch of crazy stuff. And it's always interesting. It kept my attention through this very, very long book. It is huge. So yeah, just like with their music, there's a lot here that will surprise and delight you. It definitely gave me a much deeper appreciation for who they were and what they were doing all these years when I wasn't paying attention. You know, not that they had any master plan. Well, maybe MCA did, maybe with the Tibetan Freedom concerts. But in general, they were just being who they were, just reinforcing creativity, and all of this just kind of came out naturally as they just did their thing. And I also have to say that this book is just entertaining. It's just really funny. Anyone who's seen them give an interview knows that they have a dry sense of humor, which is the best kind of humor, let's face it. Who likes sticky, wet humor? Not me. So in an interview, the boys' goal seems to be for one of them to say the most outrageous thing possible, and then the other two have to keep a straight face, at a minimum, or even better, add to what the first guy said and expand on it, making it even more absurd, all while never laughing. And it's a game, right? You're trying to say something to make the other guys crack up first, and that's how that would go. And the book is the same way. If Mike is telling a story, Ad Rock will have some marginal comments, and they might get into an argument about the finer points. Or one will chime in to correct the other, you know, that kind of thing. So the overall effect of this book is as if you were in a bar somewhere listening to these two friends tell the stories, and it's great. But don't worry, if you're a more visual person, Mike and Adam had their friend Spike Jonze produce a film of them telling these stories when they were on their book tour. And of course, it's called Beastie Boys Story, and you can search for it and watch it. Still great stuff. And of course, their book tour is all over YouTube. So if you're just mildly curious and don't want to commit to the whole film, there's still plenty for you to check out. So I read this book twice so far, all 592 pages, and it occurred to me, I should probably go back and listen to their stuff again, huh? And when I did it, I started with Ill Communication since it was the album I remembered the most. And here it is. So, let's take a closer look. So first you got to love the vintage parental advisory sticker on here. I'd like to blow that up a bit and then stick it on my car. As a kid, this cover always kind of confused me because I wasn't sure which Beastie Boy this guy was. And it just turns out he's a random guy in the 1960s attempting to order from a drive-through food joint, hence the title. Inside, we have a shot of Mario Caldato Jr. at the mixing board and the band in the live room, of course, with MCA on an upright bass. The CD looks really sweet. There's a pic under here of them playing live, and if you recall, this was the era when Mike D had the short bleached hair. Seems like yesterday, doesn't it? And, the back cover is the boys with their friends. The photos in the booklet are kind of interesting. They all just really emphasize that they were playing a lot of the instruments live, which is cool. They are also working with Mark Nishida here, DJ Hurricane, who made some key contributions and gets shout-outs in the lyrics. My overall impressions listening to this album again after 25 years was that it was really like 3 bands on one disc. And this is the formula that they started on Check Your Head that carried over to this album. Loosely speaking, each song falls into one of 3 styles. So you have your straight-up hip-hop, you have your jazz-funk instrumentals, and then you have your hardcore punk. So even though this album has a whopping 20 tracks, it never gets boring to listen to because they're always changing it up. It comes across almost as more of a mixtape than a studio album by a single band. And I also like how they blended all the tracks together into a sort of unified listening experience, like elements from one track carry into the next, or they'll have some spoken word bits that segue between the songs. It all just flows, and the production is outstanding. The record sounds fresh and great. The live jams sound completely live, and maybe they were. And the rap songs are really multi-layered with plenty of interesting samples. And what I especially like, you have multiple layers of rhythms. So you have the fat beats over your thin beats and lots of live percussion over all of that. So when you add MCA's bass, the result is always guaranteed to move your ass. And the beats start and stop. They cut in and out in an interesting way. They're not just pressing play in a boombox and rapping over it. They put a lot more thought into it. And the result is really interesting. And through it all, the Beasties' personalities really shine through. And I'm not really qualified to speak on the quality of their raps compared to their contemporaries, but it's clear to even me that they have plenty of skill and a good sense of humor. Most of the rhymes manage to pack in cultural references. Some are pretty obscure. In fact, I had to go out to this most excellent site, Beastie Boys Annotated, to get some explanations in some cases for what they're even talking about. So if you really want to dig into the lyrics or have questions, I highly recommend that site. So, let's talk about the tracks. And I'm just going to buzz through these because, there are 20 of them, and we'll be here all night. So things start off with Sure Shot, which is my second favorite here, as you might guess. It starts with a really weird sample of a dog and then jumps right into the track, which I love because it has this really badass loop of a flute part. Yes, a flute from a Jeremy Steig song called Legwork, and I urge you to go out and listen to the original. And that's another one of the things I really love about this record, folks. It's like the freaking World Wide Web because their songs have so many references in the lyrics and the samples that if you want to, you can sort of click the link, so to speak, and follow all of those things. You can go find the original songs. They list their sample sources in the liner notes, So that's a bunch of music for you to check out. And of course, you can follow up on all the stuff they mention in their lyrics as well. So there's a lot to dig into here. And, if you're a Gen Xer, some of this stuff will be somewhat familiar to you just by osmosis. You won't need explanations. But what's funny is that this song is built on a flute loop, yet there is another song later on the album called Flute Loop that's also built on a flute sample. So yeah, lots of good flute on here. But this song, Sure Shot, jams and has always been a favorite of mine. As someone who loves electronic music and beats, it delivers the mail. What else can I say? I think listening to it is still a big kick. I understand the band had trouble coming up with a chorus for it, so they called DJ Hurricane at like 2 a.m., and he came up with the chorus off the top of his head, so that's how he got a writing credit, which is really cool. Another thing I like about Sure Shot is how MCA does a call out to stop disrespecting women, and maybe it's some atonement for License to Ill, which was, goofily misogynistic as well as misanthropic. So cheers to him for being progressive and demonstrating some maturity. You got to keep in mind here, folks, that these guys were only, like 27 or 28 at the time. They were still relatively young. But, MCA was ahead of a lot of folks in a lot of ways. He was just an extraordinary guy. So cheers to him for his call out to respect the ladies. I think Sure Shot is a fantastic opener and a great song overall. It still holds up. And, of course, it was also a single and it had a video. And like most of their videos, it was just the guys mugging into the camera. And next up is Tough Guy, an ode to someone I guess Mike D didn't like playing basketball with. This is a hardcore punk song, no rapping really, just shouting. And, in some ways, I think it's a prequel to a later punk song on here called Heart Attack Man. I think maybe the two go together. Anyway, for a punk song, this has a really cool arrangement. It starts, it stops, it starts again. It's super fast. It's tight. It's an interesting, if very quick listen. Then we have B-Boys Makin' with the Freak Freak, which is a down-tempo rap song with these really goofy lyrics. It has even goofier samples. It starts with a French girl saying a bunch of stuff on the phone, and then there's this recurring sound of a goat, and a truly great sample of a comedy routine by Mantan Moreland. I won't even say any more about it, but track 4 is Bobo on the Corner. It's just a too short, in my opinion, funk rock breakdown that would sound right at home on a later Miles Davis album. It's just a great little instrumental jam, which goes right into track 5, Root Down. And this is a rap song constructed out of a loop from the song Root Down and Get It by Jimmy Smith. Again, check out the original. It's fantastic. Of course, this was also a single and a video. This time, just clips of the guys playing live, plus breakdancing and basketball. So not just the standard formula of the three of them clowning around in front of a fisheye lens. But Root Down is a great jam. Props to Jimmy Smith. The band said they heard his tune and just wanted to rhyme over it, so that's what they did. But of course, they tweaked out the arrangement so it keeps changing up throughout. Just another great track. And then we have the reason we're all here, their timeless classic, Sabotage, which, as you might know, was regularly their encore closer, the walk-off home run, if you will, and it remains the final track the band ever performed live. It is not a rap track at all, really. It's more like a rock tune with some punk screaming, courtesy of Ad Rock. And what can you say about this song? As a kid, we all loved it for its energy and for the fact that it was kind of unexpected. It just didn't sound like the other popular Beastie Boys tunes that we grew up with. And we all loved Mike D's drum stabs in the intro. To us, it was almost as iconic as the drum intro to Breathe on Ministry's live album. But I gotta say, they played this song live on Letterman in '94, and it remains one of my favorite live performances of anything, anywhere. Just the fact that these guys, who are primarily known for their frat rap stuff, strolled out there with their own instruments and gave such a powerful and spot-on performance must have blown a lot of minds among the general public. Like, first, who knew they could even play instruments? And second, who knew they could do anything other than juvenile raps? Ad Rock delivers the screams and just kind of owns the role of frontman, and the whole time, he's just playing a single chord on his guitar, an A flat major, and his guitar solo is just 3 notes, and Mike D is back there laying down the fat back. MCA is just tucked away, like cool as ever, barely moving, and just nailing his fuzz bass solo. They have live keys, scratching, and percussion. It's just 4 minutes of perfection, and arguably the band's high water mark. And on disc, it's just as powerful. In the book, they said they built the music around MCA's fuzz bass line, but didn't know what to do with it for a long time. And it sat and sat until one day Ad Rock was inspired to scream some crazy stuff about Mario, just as a goof. And I also read somewhere that the lyrics were his response to something having to do with River Phoenix's death, but I have no corroboration on that, so that might just be rumors. But anyway, there's just so much more about this song to love, like the video, for instance. And if you've never seen it, please just shut me off right now and go out and watch it. Do yourself a favor. It's iconic in a bunch of ways. It's a parody of old 70s cop shows, and the band shows up in a variety of wigs and sunglasses and mustaches as they go through the tropes of every cop show you've ever seen, up to and including Police Squad, which I swear will get its own episode here someday. And there are fake titles with fake actor names and character names, most of which are hilarious. And the whole style of the titles would inspire actual films, like the intro to Trainspotting, for instance. The director, Danny Boyle, straight up said that he stole that idea from the Sabotage video. And there's all sorts of fast-cut action sequences. You got knife fights, fast driving, fake punches, eating donuts. And they even throw a body off a bridge and another body out of a car. And in both cases, it's obvious that it's a dummy, which is just a riot. And by the way, they would play cops again later in another video, because in 2011, MCA made a short film called Fight for Your Right Revisited, which in a nutshell serves as a sequel to the original video for Fight for Your Right, but also as a real video for their song Make Some Noise from their final album, Hot Sauce Committee Part 2. And the genius of this film is that it has cameos from dozens of top Hollywood talent, too many for me to list, but get this, it stars Seth Rogen, Elijah Wood, and Danny McBride as Mike D, Ad Rock, and MCA, with John C. Reilly, Will Ferrell, and Jack Black playing future versions of Mike D, Ad Rock, and MCA, and they get into a ridiculous dance competition, which I can't even begin to describe here. Suffice to say, the 6 of them all get arrested by 3 cops who are, naturally, played by the real Beastie Boys in cop costumes, just like in Sabotage. So keep in mind, too, that MCA put this all together while undergoing cancer treatment. The guy was just an unstoppable force of nature. So check that out, too. It's about a half an hour long and has a lot of inside jokes and funny call-outs. And personally, it inspired me to pick up my own Stuyvesant Phys Ed shirt, which I gotta say just confused everybody at my house. I had to explain myself, as I often have to do, which frankly makes it less funny. Let's be honest. It's really tough being the only cool person here. Anyway, Sabotage, a Beastie high water mark, and possibly a high water mark for popular music in '94, if you don't count Closer by 9 Inch Nails. Then we slow things down a bit with Get It Together, which is a rap track featuring guest vocals by Q-Tip, and the song, of course, reinforces the line, like Ma Bell, I got ill communication from Sure Shot. Interestingly, the Beastie Boys annotated site has a link to a supposed explanation of that title from one contributor who claimed to be a friend of the band, and supposedly Ma Bell was the name of a local unhoused person, and her quirk was to pretend to have long conversations on payphones without really talking to anyone. It was just her thing, so that kind of puts the title into a new light. The band, of course, has not confirmed if that is true. It's just speculation. Track 8 is called Sabrosa, and it's a cool funk jazz instrumental. And by the way, if you like their instrumentals, you should check out their 7th album, The Mix-Up, which is entirely composed of instrumentals. It was just all of this sort of stuff. I think it's a great album. It's well worth your time. Track 9 is called The Update, and it's a groovy rap track. And then we have Futterman's Rule, which is a furious funk instrumental held down by MCA's fuzz bass. And I just love these sorts of instrumentals, I gotta say. And it reminds me that I have to get another wah pedal one of these days. Track 11, All Right Hear This, is a faster rap track, and that goes into Eugene's Lament, which is a short instrumental with some really nifty violin played by Eugene Gore. Track 13 is Flute Loop, which I mentioned before. It's less than 2 minutes long. Nice little rap track. Next up is Do It, which is a deep funk kind of rap track. Again, as a drummer, I love these beats and I love the rhythms of the words. And I also got to point out that there is a weird synth sound at the end of this song. And if you happen to have a vintage Korg Chaosilator like I do, you can almost perfectly replicate it with patch L17. I'm just saying. Of course, they recorded this 20 years before a Chaosilator was a thing. I just thought that was neat. Track 15 is Ricky's Theme, which is a mellow instrumental led by Money Mark's organ. Really nice drum fills here by Mike D. Track 16 is the aforementioned Heart Attack Man, which could not be more different from Ricky's Theme. Again, it's like there are 3 different albums here, rap, jazz, and punk. This is a punk song, obviously. I think the best part of it is the intro where Mike D just cracks himself up trying to explain the premise of the song. And, it's just a good example for how they threw these little transition bits in here to keep the album flowing. So next up is The Scoop, which is a groovy rap track. I dig it. And then a pair of tunes that go together. We have Shambhala, which is kind of a 2-parter. The first part is Tuvan throat singing, and the second part is a little instrumental with a kind of Latin feel. And the throat singers come in again at the end, and the song transitions into Bodhisattva Vow. And this is an interesting track because it's just MCA rapping about his Buddhist worldview. And MCA was a bodhisattva, that is, a person who is on the path to enlightenment. And here he really gets into what that means to him in terms of his relationships to other people. So maybe as George Harrison was to Hinduism, so MCA was to Buddhism. And he's just laying out its precepts for his listeners to make up their own minds. Anyway, I respect MCA, and I think it's cool that he included this song. I think it's the only rap on here that's not just talking about rap prowess. So it has a little more going on in the idea department. And then, we wrap things up with track 20, which is Transitions, which sounds like a selection from an old Art Blakey disc. It's just another badass instrumental, kind of down-tempo. I love how they showcased Money Mark's keyboards on this record. He adds so much to these songs, and he gives them kind of an old-school 50s or 60s jazz feel. And, I have the Blue Note box set, so I know what I'm talking about. But it really does. I think the Beasties could have put out a record like the mix-up on Blue Note Records, for sure. It was that good. They could have even played some low-key gigs at Birdland. I mean, who knows? Maybe they did, under different names. We may never know. And that's the album. 20 songs, almost exactly an hour well spent. So what happened next? I don't want to get into it too much because I may talk about some of their other albums, but this was their 4th studio album, and they'd go on to release 4 more before MCA's death in 2012. All the later albums, apart from the mix-up, which is kind of an oddball, take a similar kitchen sink approach to songwriting and production, which really keeps them from getting boring, in my opinion. The Beasties were a very talented and versatile group. Why do I love them? Well, I think what makes them great is the fact that their personalities shine through everything they do while still delivering the mail. I mean, they always bring it, but with style. And Ill Communication is special to me because it's the album I remember the most from growing up. But I think there is something to love in all their albums. Their sense of humor really appeals to me. See, back in the 90s, absurdist kind of non sequitur humor was the thing. Like, bring in completely random references that have no connection to anything. And that's what the Beasties are doing in all these lyrics. And they're just doing them super fast, one after the other. You can hardly keep up. You're either in the know, or if you want to know what they're talking about, you have some research to do. And that makes the lyrics fun. Like, they're playing a game. How many associations can we make? How much can we pack in here? And the lyrics are very dense, for sure. They demonstrate an encyclopedic knowledge of pop culture through the 70s and 80s, and I think that's cool. But I also love their musicianship on this album, the variety of musical styles. I also like the way they apply their creativity to every aspect of the band, from the music to the artwork to the videos to the interviews. They were just true artists in everything they did. Even their interviews were performance art. The entire band was performance art, really. And, if you recall this era of the band in 94, they were also running their label, and they had a regular zine that came out, both of them called Grand Royal, and they were putting a lot of themselves into that stuff as well. So around this time, the Beastie Boys were masters of all media, and they were everywhere. Kind of the opposite of the stereotype of Gen Xers being slackers, because they were workaholics. And who isn't a workaholic when you're doing what you love as your work? And I find that inspiring. Doing what you love, having other people love it, it's a positive feedback loop. Maybe the most important loop of the Beasties' career, one that would keep rolling and rolling and rolling through 2012 and even beyond in some ways. So I salute their creativity, motivation, and positive outlook. That's why I love them, and this record in particular. Well, there you have it, folks, a mainstay of 90s culture, Beastie Boys, and their classic album, Ill Communication. I would call it a breakthrough record based on Sabotage alone, but the fact is they had already broken through 8 years prior. But if you think about it, that was really another band in some ways. They were a very different band at first. One that was largely led by Rick Rubin, who had a very heavy hand in that record's production. And Paul's Boutique went a different way entirely. It was really Check Your Head that established their new direction. And it was Ill Communication that would truly bring it to the fore. So I think this is an important album, as well as a great listen. If you find the Beasties interesting at all, I urge you to check out their book or documentary, Beastie Boys Book and Beastie Boys Story. There's just a lot to amaze and amuse there, and you might just find yourself inspired by what you find. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason either on YouTube or as an Apple or Spotify podcast, the show that is not loving climate change right now. I mean, since when is the Northeast hotter than Southern Texas? What's up with that? On the plus side, I won't have to mow my lawn until September, if I even have a lawn left at that time. So stay safe out there, folks. Check in on your neighbors, help each other out, be cool, and stay cool. And as always, I thank you for listening, and until next time, stay strong.